Hey guys, tonight we're going to slowly, very slowly, wander through the entire life of Julius Caesar. Picture it, the dusty streets of Rome under a fading sun, the chatter of toga-clad citizens mingling with the occasional clatter of cartwheels. You probably won't survive this whole story without nodding off at least once. But don't worry, that's kind of the point. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, post your location and local time in the comments. I like seeing where my fellow history travelers are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are born into a world of stark contrasts. On one side, the patricians, with their polished shoes and polished manners, the kind of people who discuss lineage like it's a game of Monopoly, and on the other, the plebeians, bustling, shouting, smelling faintly of bread and manure. Julius Caesar's family, the Julii, is ancient, proud, and not exactly rolling in gold, but their reputation carries weight. You feel the pulse of ambition in the air, even in a child's play, and you realize that young Caesar, barely old enough to swing a toy sword, is already absorbing these subtle currents of power and expectation. Historians still argue whether his family's relative obscurity compared to other patricians made him hungrier, or if ambition is just the natural state of a restless mind. You trudge through the narrow, crowded streets of the Suburra, dodging carts and shouting vendors, and notice little details, the smell of olives roasting, the hum of conversation in a dozen dialects, the occasional street performer juggling knives and apples, probably hoping no one trips on their sandals. Caesar's early life is punctuated by festivals, religious ceremonies, and a steady diet of lessons in Roman etiquette. He learns to bow just so, to nod with subtle deference, and to speak with confidence that borders on insolence, a combination that will serve him in both the Senate and the battlefield. And yes, in his youth, he was said to wear a peculiar sort of crocodile dung sunscreen on his face during certain ceremonies to protect from the sun. Quirky, yes, but apparently effective. You trudge with him through the villas and gardens, hearing the stories of ancestors who claimed descent from Venus herself. The family line is proud but patchy, sometimes exaggerated in ways that remind you of a social media influencer polishing their past. You probably won't survive all these ancestry claims without a tiny yawn. But the lessons stick. Heritage matters, even when it's selectively remembered. Even as a child, Caesar begins to absorb the importance of image, reputation, and the subtle art of seeming both approachable and untouchable. It's like learning a chess game before you can even count the pieces. Life at home is a mixture of discipline and occasional indulgence. His father, also named Gaius, is strict but not cruel, while his mother, Aurelia, provides a calm presence, whispering advice, and perhaps sly jokes about the absurdity of some patrician customs. You notice as you wander these rooms that she seems to have more influence than anyone formally allowed in the city. Historians still argue whether her guidance or his father's early death had a greater effect on molding Caesar's temperament, a debate that will follow biographers for centuries. By the time you reach adolescence, Caesar is already displaying audacity. You watch him take small risks, testing boundaries with his peers and seeing how much the adults will tolerate before intervention. It's as though he's mapping the edges of social power in micro steps, each daring act a lesson in what authority can and cannot withstand. You might smirk at the thought of young Caesar sneaking off to the forum to eavesdrop on speeches, probably tripping over a toga while practicing the art of persuasion before he even understood the word. The city itself is alive around him. You breathe in the scent of tanneries mixed with incense from the temples. The soundscape alternates between clanging smiths and the softer hum of scribes copying texts. You probably won't survive the sensory overload if you actually tried walking these streets today. But imagine Caesar navigating them daily, already calculating the paths people take, the alliances that form in whispers, the eyes that notice, and the ears that never forget. By the end of this early life, you begin to sense the duality that will define him, a blend of curiosity and calculation, charm and cunning, playfulness and strategic ambition. You might laugh softly, imagining him tossing stones at a neighbor's roof for sport, only to apologize with a grin and a promise of political favors years later. Quirky childhood behavior foreshadowing imperial maneuvering. Some historians still argue whether this early cleverness was innate genius or learned opportunism. And so, your journey through Caesar's early life closes on the image of a restless boy watching the Tiber flow past the city, imagining not just what Rome is, but what it could be, and perhaps imagining himself at the center of it all, though not fully aware that the path ahead will be messy, dazzling, and utterly unforgettable. You wake the next morning to the soft, uneven light filtering through the high windows of a Roman domus, the faint smell of olive oil lamps still lingering in the air. You trudge past servants arranging scrolls and ink pots, feeling the hum of expectation pressing down lightly but insistently. Young Julius Caesar, not yet the towering figure who will command legions and captivate the Senate, is already sharpening the tools of his mind. You probably won't survive the sheer volume of lessons in rhetoric and oratory he endures without nodding off occasionally. But stay with me. You'll see these early hours shape everything to come. So, as Caesar leans over wax tablets, you can almost hear the scratch of stylus on wax, the repetition of alphabets and phrases that will one day charm a Senate into awe or compliance. You watch him struggle at first, his hands awkward, his intonation uneven, but a spark of curiosity keeps him going. He studies not just words, but cadence, inflection, and the invisible rules that govern persuasion. Historians still argue whether his legendary eloquence was the result of natural genius or the sheer discipline of relentless practice, probably a bit of both, like a cocktail mixed by the gods of ambition. Outside, the city stretches in a panorama of human activity. You hear the faint braying of donkeys, the rhythmic pounding of hammers in distant workshops, and the occasional shout from the Subura, where the poor and rowdy congregate. Caesar's education isn't confined to scrolls and tutors. It extends into the streets, where observation teaches subtleties that no lecture ever could. You notice him learning to read expressions, to note the subtle gestures of respect, fear, or envy. and to calculate reactions before words even leave his mouth. A cheeky thought crosses your mind. He's basically doing what every modern influencer does. Study your audience, craft your image, but with swords and senators instead of likes and comments. The lessons are long and the tutors are strict. You trudge with Caesar through lessons in Greek, Latin, history, and moral philosophy. And sometimes you get the sense that even the walls are listening, waiting to see if this boy will rise above the noise of his peers. His mother, Aurelia, hovers nearby, a quiet force of reason and encouragement, while his father's early death leaves a shadow that both motivates and haunts him. You probably won't survive thinking about all the pressure packed into these formative years without a small shiver, but it's the kind of pressure that makes leaders, not just children. Among the facts, there are also quirky details that make you smirk. For instance, young Caesar reportedly had a fondness for dressing up as a god during festivals, strutting around in elaborate costumes to the mild horror of his tutors. It's the sort of flamboyant behavior that makes you wonder if he was auditioning for history even before history knew it needed him. He also reportedly suffered from mild epilepsy, or perhaps it was fainting spells, but it didn't slow him down. If anything, it made him more determined to assert control over every part of his life, a trait that will follow him onto battlefields and into the Senate alike. You wander with him through early friendships and rivalries, noting how alliances form in whispers over dinner tables, how minor competitions can shape character. Caesar learns to be charming without being naive, shrewd without being cruel, though you can see glimpses of both, tucked behind a mischievous grin or a playful jab at a peer's haircut. Historians still argue whether his early social maneuvers were instinctive or coached, but the results are clear. The boy is learning the art of influence, and Rome, like a sleeping lion, waits to be awakened. The sensory detail of his studies, the soft scratch of wax, the smell of ink and parchment, the faint sound of distant voices carrying rumors, all blend into a steady rhythm that lulls yet sharpens. You imagine Caesar walking through the atrium after a long morning of lessons, practicing speeches aloud, hearing his own voice echo against marble columns, and adjusting until he finds the cadence that will someday move crowds to tears or loyalty. It's tedious and beautiful all at once, like watching paint dry in the glow of candlelight, but knowing that paint will later cover an empire. Even during these formative lessons, Caesar's mind drifts to strategy and observation. You follow him as he notes the movement of city guards, the positioning of merchants, and the behaviors of those with power or influence. This isn't mere curiosity. It's the early mapping of networks, power structures, and human patterns. He jots these observations in private, small scratches on paper that hint at future campaigns and political maneuvers. And while he's technically still a child, you feel the shape of a leader forming in real time, someone who will not merely participate in Rome's life, but command it. As dusk falls, the city softens. You trudge with Caesar to the rooftops, looking down on the Tiber's gentle shimmer. The distant clatter of late markets mingles with the smell of roasting meats and the faint aroma of fresh bread. You might notice that even here, in these quiet moments, he's practicing his memory, reciting speeches and lessons under his breath, refining cadence and tone. There's a sense that everything, even the mundane, is a rehearsal for larger stages yet unseen. Historians still argue whether this level of dedication at such an age was exceptional or a common trait among ambitious Roman youth. But it feels in this moment like destiny tightening its grip. By the time night settles, you trudge back with him to the cool stone of his bedchamber, where candlelight flickers against painted walls, and you realize that this relentless combination of discipline, observation, and small audacity is the secret to his eventual greatness. You probably won't survive all the tiny lessons of this day without feeling a bit exhausted. But in the fatigue is the seed of understanding. This boy is laying the groundwork for everything that will follow, from public office to conquest, from whispers in the Senate to the roar of legions marching under banners bearing his name. You trudge out at dawn, the first golden light spilling over the Tiber, mixing with the smoke of distant hearths, and you feel the weight of the road ahead. Caesar is still young, but already restless, drawn to the discipline and adrenaline of military life. You probably won't survive imagining the endless marches and muddy encampments without squirming a little, but stick with me. This is where ambition first tangibly meets action. His first military service, modest compared to the campaigns that will later define him, is both a proving ground and a classroom. You follow him along the rough roads leading to the provinces of Asia Minor, where the scent of wild herbs mingles with the metallic tang of weapons, and soldiers rehearse drills in the early light. His early posting is small, almost trivial by later standards, but you notice how Caesar approaches it, observing officers, noting terrain, and testing tactics against the occasional skirmish with unruly locals. There is a tangible thrill here, the smell of damp earth, the bite of cold wind, the clatter of armor, and the soft murmur of soldiers speculating about the young officer who already has the spark of leadership. Historians still argue whether his early bravery was innate or cultivated by tutors and family pressure. But the effect is undeniable. He begins to grasp the interplay of authority, charisma, and fear. Quirky details emerge even on these early campaigns. You learn that young Caesar, despite his focus, had a peculiar habit of practicing swordplay in his tent wearing theatrical masks. It's a strange mix of ritual, performance, and preparation, almost like a child imagining himself both hero and spectator. You might chuckle imagining him ducking out of sight when a superior officer catches him, or perhaps the masks themselves helped him visualize enemies' expressions during later battles, a mix of psychological insight and eccentricity. The early military routines are grueling. You trudge with him through marshy fields, listen to the harsh commands barked over the clamor of drills, and feel the sting of dust in your eyes. Caesar studies not only tactics, but human nature. He notices which soldiers excel under pressure, which flinch, and who murmurs loyalty versus treachery. You probably won't survive imagining all the mud, sweat, and minor humiliations without flinching. But every detail forms the subtle blueprint for the charismatic and strategic leader he will become. When Caesar is not in drills or skirmishes, You follow him observing logistics, the movement of supplies, the placement of campfires, and the allocation of rations are all part of his informal education in command. He experiments with minor decisions, testing morale, and studying consequences. Historians still argue whether these small exercises were consciously strategic or simply the trial and error of a curious, ambitious mind. But even now, you can sense the emergence of a leader capable of thinking 10 steps ahead while marching in the mud. Alongside the discipline of military life comes social learning. You trudge with him to modest banquets and exchanges with local officials, absorbing cultural nuances, barter customs, and the subtle dance of respect and influence. He practices persuasion with a deft smile, noting how authority can shift depending on tone and timing. Occasionally, you catch him in quiet humor, tossing a roasted olive at a friend and ducking as it sails past, a momentary lapse of levity amid the serious business of soldiering. You probably won't survive the combination of drill, strategy, and comedy without a faint smile, but it humanizes him in a way textbooks often forget. The first real taste of combat is brief but instructive. You feel the tension in the air, the scent of smoldering brush, the quick clatter of spears, and the distant cry of dismounted scouts. Caesar does not yet command entire legions, but he moves among the troops with keen observation, noting morale, enemy tactics, and the chaos of even minor encounters. Quirky rumors persist that he once used a clever distraction, a goat tied to a wagon, bleating loudly, to mislead an enemy patrol. Historians still argue whether this is true or apocryphal, but it certainly captures the essence of his cunning and creativity. Even in these first military experiences, Caesar begins to understand the interplay between perception and reality. You notice him carefully cultivating appearances, whether in the arrangement of banners or the timing of speeches, so that his actions seem bolder than they are, more decisive than mere luck could explain. You probably won't survive all the layers of psychological strategy without a little mental vertigo. But this is where the mind meets the battlefield in a nascent form that will define his future. By the end of this early military chapter, you trudge alongside him under fading light, the smell of cooking fires and wet grass lingering in the air. The young officer returns to his tent, brushes dirt from his tunic, and reflects on the day's lessons. Some learned the hard way, some absorbed quietly through observation. You realize that every march, every skirmish, and every small act of improvisation has already begun shaping the disciplined, cunning, and charismatic leader who will someday cross the Rubicon, confront legions, and captivate the entire Roman world. You step into the bustling heart of Rome, the forum alive with chatter, merchants hawking wares, and senators adjusting their togas as though they could iron out ambition itself. You probably won't survive imagining the endless whispering corridors of power without letting out a small sigh. But here, in the midst of intrigue and ceremony, Caesar's political apprenticeship begins. You follow him as he navigates the labyrinthine social hierarchy, a place where charm, timing, and a well-placed compliment can outweigh even the sharpest sword. His early political moves are subtle, almost invisible if you're not paying close attention. You watch him attending minor magistracies, taking notes on who smiles, who sneers, who listens, and who glares. The lessons are both formal and accidental. Debates on the Senate floor, whispered conversations in porticos, and observing the ebb and flow of alliances that could shift in a heartbeat. Historians still argue whether Caesar's skill at reading people was instinct or honed deliberately, but the results are unmistakable. He begins to see Rome not as a collection of laws and monuments, but as a living, breathing network of influence, ambition, and occasionally petty grudges. You trudge alongside him as he makes connections, small and large. The atrium of a senator's house is thick with incense and polite laughter, the clink of cups punctuating veiled threats. He greets older patricians with respectful bows, yet there is always a glint of audacity in his eye, a subtle reminder that he is aware of his own potential. Quirky tales persist from this period. He allegedly kept a pet raven that he claimed could deliver messages to allies in coded cause, a small eccentricity that hints at both humor and strategic thinking. You probably won't survive imagining the logistics of messenger birds and political espionage without chuckling. But it shows early creativity in maneuvering beyond the obvious. Formal education continues alongside social learning. You follow him into lecture halls and private discussions where rhetoric, law, and history intertwine. You feel the weight of memory exercises, debates, and recitations pressing upon him, shaping a mind capable of both analytical rigor and persuasive flourish. These lessons are not merely academic, they are rehearsals for performance. The young Caesar practices inflection, gestures, and timing, noticing which phrases draw nods and which provoke murmurs. Historians still argue whether these early speeches were more performative than substantive, but it's clear that Caesar understands the power of spectacle as much as substance. As the weeks and months pass, he encounters rivalries that teach lessons books never could. You trudge through whispered insults and shadowed corridors, overhear veiled threats during casual conversations, and sense the tension that pervades Roman political life. Every minor snub, every comment about lineage or wealth becomes a training ground for patience, strategic response, and the art of returning insult with calculated grace. You probably won't survive all the subtle social warfare without blinking at least twice, but it's essential to understanding how Caesar later manipulates both public opinion and senatorial politics. Among the structured lessons, there are also more playful moments. You might catch him orchestrating clever pranks at festivals, subtly mocking rivals while preserving appearances, or engaging in theatrical displays of oratory to impress peers. These episodes reveal a mind capable of combining humor, timing, and strategy, a pattern that will repeat on battlefields, tribunals, and public forums alike. Quirky, yes, but also revealing. Even in levity, he is practicing influence. The sensory experience of these years is vivid. You breathe the smoke from hearths mingled with dust from busy streets, hear the clash of informal debates, and feel the subtle shifts in atmosphere as alliances and power plays ripple through crowded halls. Caesar moves within it like a shadow learning to command light, absorbing cues, calibrating responses and planting seeds that will one day grow into unstoppable momentum. Historians still argue whether he ever truly misstepped during these early political experiments, or whether every faux pas was part of a larger strategy. But either way, it is clear that the lessons embed themselves deeply, forming a foundation of acute perception and adaptive strategy. By the end of these early political years, you trudge with him down the streets of Rome, past the marketplace, past the temples, past the crowds who do not yet know the power of this young man's mind. You feel the tension of observation and the thrill of subtle influence, the rush of successfully navigating a social minefield without triggering scandal or insult. It's exhausting, yet exhilarating. The young Caesar's mind, already disciplined from early studies and military experiences, begins to wield social power with the same precision he will later apply to legions, alliances, and ultimately, an empire. You probably won't survive thinking about all the micro moves without a small headache, but it's in these details that the seeds of Caesar's formidable political genius take root. You trudge through the sun-drenched streets of Rome once again, the forum's marble gleaming, merchants hawking figs and wine, and you feel the subtle weight of history pressing in. Julius Caesar is no longer merely learning, he is climbing. You probably won't survive imagining the sheer patience and persistence required to move up Rome's political ladder without letting out a long sigh. But these steps, small and deliberate, shape the trajectory that will later shake the Republic itself. You follow him as he assumes increasingly significant offices: Quaestor, Aedile, and eventually Pontifex Maximus. Each role brings new visibility, responsibilities, and, inevitably, enemies. You hear the clatter of official business, the rustle of togas, the subtle murmurs in Senate corridors. Caesar's approach is methodical. He executes duties, entertains the right crowds, and gently manipulates circumstances to his advantage. Historians still argue whether his success is due more to natural charisma or meticulous planning, but you notice how effortlessly he blends both, turning mundane responsibilities into opportunities for influence and visibility. The climb is punctuated with political theater. You watch as Caesar funds lavish games, gladiatorial shows, and public feasts, drawing the populace to his side while simultaneously testing rivals' patience. You probably won't survive imagining the smell of roasted meat, the roar of crowds, and the occasional firework, or whatever passed for fireworks in Rome, without feeling a little dizzy. But these spectacles are not mere entertainment. They are lessons in public persuasion and mass psychology. Quirky stories from this period claim he once released 100 geese during a festival to create controlled chaos, earning both laughter and begrudging admiration. Alongside public spectacle, Caesar sharpens his legal and rhetorical skills. You trudge with him through courtrooms, noting every gesture, every pause, every subtle inflection in speech that persuades a judge or jury. He begins to understand the power of narrative, of framing events to highlight virtue while obscuring flaws. Historians still argue whether this talent was cultivated intentionally from childhood or discovered serendipitously through repeated trial and error. But the effect is clear. Caesar's influence grows not just through office, but through perception. You notice as you wander with him that alliances and networks are as crucial as formal authority. Caesar cultivates friendships with the wealthy, indebted clients and key senators, always maintaining a balance between loyalty and leverage. You probably won't survive all the subtle negotiations and backroom maneuvering without a faint groan, but it's a masterclass in strategy. The whispering corridors, the handshakes that are never simple, and the careful attention to who benefits and who resents, all of it feeds into the machinery of power. Quirky human details continue to emerge. Caesar reportedly had a fondness for elaborate hats during official processions, which were more fashion statement than functional. Some even joked that the feathers distracted the opposition. You imagine the mild eye rolls from older senators, the subtle nods from supporters, and the way such eccentricities can humanize a figure otherwise surrounded by grandeur. Small, calculated quirks, they say, make leaders memorable, and Caesar remembers everything. Even with rising power comes risk. You trudge alongside him through tense debates, noticing the glances of enemies who wait for a misstep. One false move could ruin a career, or worse. You probably won't survive imagining the anxiety, the careful parsing of every word, and the mental gymnastics needed to navigate rivalries without error. But this is where Caesar hones the resilience that will later allow him to confront civil war and political assassination alike. Historians still argue about which early enemies posed the greatest threat and how much he genuinely feared them. But it's clear he learned to blend caution with audacity. By the end of this period, Caesar's rise is undeniable. You trudge through the streets with him, past the forum, past the temples, past the adoring and wary citizens alike. You see a man who has learned to turn opportunity into advantage, to combine spectacle, intelligence, and charm into a potent mix that moves people and bends circumstances. The foundations of power, once abstract lessons in family homes and lecture halls, have become real, tangible, and replicable. You probably won't survive imagining all the simultaneous threads he manages without feeling a little dizzy. But you do feel the energy, the momentum, and the irresistible pull of ambition that will carry him into conquest, civil war, and history itself. You trudge alongside Caesar as the weight of his reputation begins to manifest in unexpected ways. The city hums with whispers of alliances, the rustle of senatorial robes brushing against marble floors, and the distant clatter of wagons bringing goods into the forum. You probably won't survive imagining how every step he takes is watched by friend and foe alike, but the tension is electric, and it teaches a subtle truth. Visibility is both weapon and risk. Caesar has now stepped onto the stage where minor missteps could have monumental consequences, and every word and gesture is carefully measured. He begins forming the alliances that will later define the first triumvirate. You follow him as he cultivates connections with Crassus, the wealthy magnate whose coffers support bold ventures, and Pompey, a celebrated general whose reputation rivals Caesar's own budding legend. The interplay of personalities is intricate. You notice the give and take, the subtle concessions, and the calculated flattery. Historians still argue about which ally Caesar valued most strategically and which he personally liked. But from here, you see the skill in balancing influence with ego. You probably won't survive thinking about the mental energy required to keep all these relationships aligned without a small shiver. But the payoff is monumental. The city itself becomes a training ground for perception and manipulation. You trudge past market stalls, hearing the clamor of citizens eager for entertainment, bread, or gossip, and realize that public favor is currency in its own right. Caesar learns to weave spectacle with promise, to charm the populace while nudging senators toward compliance. Quirky reports from the time suggest he once staged a mock funeral for a fictitious enemy to test public reactions, a tactic historians still debate, though its ingenuity is unquestioned. Military command continues to shape his political acumen. You watch as he deploys legions with precision, negotiating both logistics and morale with an instinct that seems preternatural. You notice his attention to detail, the placement of scouts, the rotation of watch ships, the manner of speaking to soldiers to inspire confidence and loyalty. Even small decisions, who receives praise, who is disciplined, how victories are reported, cement his growing mastery of perception. Historians still argue about whether Caesar's early campaigns in Gaul were exceptional for his genius or merely fortunate, but the learning curve is undeniably steep. You also observe his personal discipline. Despite the whirlwind of politics and military demands, Caesar maintains study, practice, and reflection. You trudge with him through evenings spent memorizing speeches, rehearsing strategy, or writing letters that are equally public and private, each word chosen with deliberate care. It's exhausting, yes, but formative. Quirky stories hint that he sometimes dictated letters while bathing, a detail that brings a small smile, yet underscores his relentless drive. You probably won't survive imagining all this multitasking without feeling slightly overwhelmed, but it's a glimpse into the machinery behind the myth. Tension and danger are constant companions. You feel it in the air as you trudge past allies who whisper of conspiracies, rival generals who test loyalty, and the constant threat of political miscalculation. Caesar navigates these waters with a mix of charm, foresight, and audacity. Historians still argue about the precise motives behind some of his most audacious moves, whether they were calculated for political gain or driven by personal ambition. But you can feel the razor's edge on which he walks. By the time night falls over the city, you trudge with him back to his domus, the scent of warm bread and olive oil greeting him like a small reward for another day of juggling politics, strategy, and perception. He reflects quietly, considering what worked, what failed, and what might be attempted tomorrow. You probably won't survive imagining all the threads he's managing at once without a dizzying sense of awe. But it's here, in these quiet, strategic reflections, that Caesar's brilliance crystallizes. He is learning to command not only armies and offices, but perception itself, a skill that will carry him through Gaul, Rome, and ultimately the annals of history. You trudge with Caesar into the swirling chaos of Gaul, the landscape both beautiful and brutal, rivers cutting through thick forests, mist rolling off swamps, and the constant distant echo of horns signaling movements of tribes and scouts. You probably won't survive imagining the endless, grueling marches and the biting cold of dawn without wincing. But this is where Caesar's mettle as a military genius truly begins to crystallize. Every day is a lesson in strategy, endurance, and the psychology of both ally and enemy. You follow him as he assesses terrain, studies river crossings, and evaluates enemy positions with meticulous care. Each decision carries weight, and missteps could mean disaster. Historians still argue whether Caesar's tactical brilliance was innate or honed entirely through rigorous study and trial, but the results are undeniable. Victories pile up, morale soars, and his reputation spreads faster than the legions themselves. You notice the sensory details, the crunch of frost under boots, the scent of campfires blending with damp earth, and the sharp metallic tang of weapons in the morning air, details that he never ignores. Alongside the discipline of battle, you observe his attention to communication. He writes dispatches, codifies reports, and instructs envoys with a precision that ensures both clarity and persuasion. Quirky accounts suggest he sometimes had messages delivered by masked actors, adding theatrical flair that baffled opponents while amusing his troops. You probably won't survive picturing the combination of military precision and playful showmanship without a grin, but it exemplifies how Caesar blends psychology, logistics, and imagination into a single, potent approach. You also notice how he builds loyalty. You trudge alongside as he praises soldiers publicly, distributes spoils judiciously, and listens to grievances, making each man feel recognized and indispensable. Historians still argue whether these gestures were entirely strategic or reflected genuine empathy, but their effectiveness is clear. The legions come to trust and even revere him. Even in harsh campaigns, there are small human moments, a shared meal, a quiet conversation by the fire, that cement bonds stronger than mere duty. Strategic ingenuity emerges in every maneuver. You watch as he outflanks opponents, uses natural features as force multipliers, and occasionally stages daring distractions that bewilder enemy commanders. The quirky, once, Caesar reportedly used a herd of cattle to divert a Gallic tribe, turning animals into unwitting weapons, a tactic historians still debate as fact or myth. You probably won't survive imagining the logistics and timing of such maneuvers without blinking in disbelief. Yet it captures his flair for unconventional solutions. Even during intense campaigns, Caesar's mind remains agile for diplomacy. You trudge with him through meetings with tribal leaders, negotiating temporary alliances, surrender terms, and hostage exchanges. The delicate balance between intimidation and incentive is maintained with careful words, gestures, and calculated presence. Historians still argue whether his early negotiations reflect genuine diplomacy or clever manipulation. But the results, temporary peace, tribute, and strategic advantage, speak volumes. By nightfall, you trudge with him back to the encampment. Soldiers clean weapons, tents flap in the wind, and Caesar walks slowly, surveying the camp. Even in moments of exhaustion, he reflects which maneuver worked, which tribes were predictable, and where human behavior diverged from expectation. You probably won't survive imagining the constant mental load alongside physical fatigue without a sigh of respect. But it's here, in the combination of observation, endurance, and creativity, that Caesar's legendary military mind is forged. You trudge with Caesar as Gaul's campaigns intensify. The scent of pine and river mud thick in the air, the distant clamor of shields and horns a constant reminder of the stakes. You probably won't survive imagining the relentless rhythm of marches, sieges, and skirmishes without a tired groan. But each day teaches him and you lessons about resilience, psychology, and the mechanics of power. Caesar's genius is now fully on display, blending courage, calculation, and charisma into a form both magnetic and terrifying. You follow him as he faces the formidable Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix. Every movement, from scouting to troop deployment, is precise. Every word to subordinates carries authority and clarity. Historians still argue whether Caesar's victory at Alesia was inevitable due to superior strategy or contingent on luck and tribal missteps. But you can see the deliberate orchestration, fortifications, double lines, and psychological pressure applied to foes and allies alike. You notice the tension in the air, the metallic tang of armor, the smell of smoke from distant fires, the low murmur of troops anticipating orders. Amid the rigor, quirky moments persist. You trudge with him past a campfire where soldiers joke about a supposed haunted hill that Caesar insisted must be secured before dawn. Some accounts claim he staged a minor spectral distraction to motivate troops, a story historians still debate, though it illustrates his flair for morale management. You probably won't survive imagining him balancing superstition, strategy, and discipline without a small chuckle. Yet it exemplifies the interplay of psychology and command that defines his leadership. He also deepens his understanding of logistics. You watch as he ensures supplies, reinforcements, and medical care reach troops efficiently, sometimes improvising when bridges wash out or roads are blocked. Historians still argue how much credit goes to Caesar personally versus capable staff, but the effectiveness of his campaigns suggests a mind constantly anticipating contingencies, reading both terrain and human behavior. You trudge alongside as he checks on messengers, ration distributions, and defensive placements, learning the invisible gears that turn the machinery of conquest. Personal observation continues in parallel. You notice him listening, noting reactions of tribal leaders, gauging loyalty among conquered peoples, and testing trust with subtle incentives or threats. Quirky stories suggest he sometimes held mock trials for minor infractions in full view of allies and enemies, teaching law, fairness, and fear simultaneously. You probably won't survive picturing such theatrical justice alongside real bloodshed without shaking your head. Yet it demonstrates how he blends human insight with spectacle. Even amid exhaustion, Caesar reflects on failures as keenly as victories. You trudge with him through night watches, considering what tactics flopped, which alliances shifted unexpectedly, and how small errors could cascade into disaster. Historians still argue whether he was unusually self-critical or merely meticulous, but the pattern is clear. He absorbs every outcome, reshaping strategy continuously. You probably won't survive imagining the mental endurance required alongside the physical. But it's in this crucible that Caesar's decisive, adaptable genius is cemented. By the time night blankets the Gallic landscape, you trudge alongside him through the quiet of the camp. Soldiers sleep under the stars, campfires flicker, and the occasional hoot of an owl punctuates the darkness. Caesar sits, writing notes, reflecting on battles and behavior, and preparing for the next challenge. You probably won't survive the combination of unrelenting exertion, high stakes, and careful observation without awe. But it's here, amid fatigue and triumph, that you begin to understand why history remembers him as both relentless and cunning, a leader who molds every detail, human and environmental alike, into victory. You trudge with Caesar as the campaigns stretch deeper into Gaul, the landscape shifting from dense forests to rolling plains, rivers widening into formidable obstacles. You probably won't survive imagining the endless coordination of legions, scouts, and supply lines without your head spinning. But this is the theater where Caesar's strategic vision becomes almost uncanny. Each day is a balance between risk and foresight, intuition and calculation, human temperament and the whims of nature. You follow him as he maneuvers against multiple Gallic tribes simultaneously, deploying legions with surgical precision. The clamor of camp life, the clink of armor, the rhythmic pounding of marching feet, the hiss of forges repairing equipment fills the air, yet Caesar remains acutely aware of every detail. Historians still argue whether his rapid advances were brilliant improvisation or a product of meticulous planning, but you can feel the careful layering of strategy, fortified camps, supply chains, and deceptive maneuvers that bewilder opponents while preserving troop morale. Amid this intensity, quirky moments surface. You trudge alongside as he experiments with unusual methods to confuse enemies, floating towers on rivers, sudden night raids timed with eclipses, and, according to rumor, using flaming pigs to scatter enemy horses. Historians still debate the authenticity of some anecdotes, but they reveal Caesar's willingness to blend audacity, creativity, and spectacle to achieve objectives. You probably won't survive imagining the logistics of flaming pigs or floating siege towers without wincing, yet it captures his flair for turning imagination into tactical advantage. You notice, too, the human element. Caesar continually gauges soldiers' moods, listens to grievances, and rewards initiative, ensuring loyalty not just through fear, but respect. You trudge with him as he mediates disputes among legions, balancing discipline with morale. Historians still argue whether his charisma or careful management created enduring loyalty, but the unwavering dedication of his troops suggests a combination of both. The psychological game extends to conquered tribes. Caesar negotiates surrender, enforces tribute, and occasionally stages symbolic acts to demonstrate both mercy and power. You probably won't survive imagining the tension in these negotiations, the subtle cues, and the constant mental juggling, but this is the foundation of his ability to command vast territories with relatively minimal oversight. Quirky notes from contemporaries suggest he sometimes used riddles or cryptic challenges to test leaders' intelligence and adaptability, a blend of pedagogy and strategy that historians still find fascinating. Even in the cold and mud of extended campaigns, Caesar reflects, writes, and strategizes. You trudge alongside as he drafts reports to Rome, ensuring victories are recorded with precision and allies praised, while missteps are framed as learning experiences. Historians still argue about the reliability of these writings, propaganda, diary, or both, but they undeniably shape both contemporary and historical perception. You probably won't survive imagining the mental load, the constant vigilance, and the endurance required without marveling at his stamina. But it's in these grueling routines, combining observation, adaptability, and foresight, that Caesar solidifies his reputation not only as a general, but as a shaper of human events. By nightfall, the camp settles into uneasy quiet. Fires flicker, shadows stretch across tents, and Caesar moves among sleeping soldiers, checking silently, making notes, and contemplating tomorrow's maneuvers. You probably won't survive picturing the exhaustion, the calculations, and the quiet, relentless drive without a sense of awe. But it is here, under stars and strategy alike, that the threads of conquest, leadership, and legacy begin to weave together, creating a tapestry that will define history itself. You trudge with Caesar as Gaul starts to bend beneath his command, the once wild lands now dotted with fortified camps, supply depots, and watchtowers that hum with disciplined activity. You probably won't survive imagining the sheer scale of coordinating tens of thousands of soldiers, engineers, and auxiliaries, all moving like clockwork while rivers, forests, and enemy tribes threaten chaos at every turn. But this is the crucible where his genius consolidates into near myth. You follow him as he anticipates rebellions and intercepts coordinated resistance, using intelligence gathered from scouts, spies, and sometimes defecting tribes. Historians still argue whether his ability to predict enemy maneuvers was innate brilliance or tireless observation. But the effectiveness of his campaigns suggests a combination of instinct and careful planning. You notice the subtle sensory details, the metallic scent of weapons being oiled, the rhythmic stamping of feet on wooden bridges, the whispers of officers interpreting orders, and how Caesar absorbs all of it, creating mental maps of terrain, morale, and opportunity. Quirky moments punctuate even the harshest military realities. You trudge with him past an incident in which he reportedly staged a phantom legion using torches at night, creating illusions that unnerved the Gallic tribes. Historians still debate whether the event actually occurred, but it underscores Caesar's willingness to use psychological tricks alongside conventional force. You probably won't survive imagining the confusion of the enemy and the satisfaction of the strategist without a quiet chuckle. Yet it's a perfect illustration of how perception can rival brute strength. You also witness the deepening loyalty of his legions. Caesar listens, praises, and disciplines with an artistry that ensures obedience and respect. You trudge alongside as he mediates disputes, motivates soldiers through speeches that combine rhetoric, humor, and insight, and rewards ingenuity on the field. Historians still argue whether his charisma or his strategic genius fostered loyalty, but the combination is unmistakable. Soldiers fight not just because of orders, but because they believe in the man leading them. Even in the heat of campaigns, he thinks of Rome, writing letters that blend tactical updates with political positioning. You probably won't survive imagining the mental gymnastics of managing distant political allies while commanding a mobile army without some dizziness. But it's here that the foundations of his eventual crossing of the Rubicon are laid. Quirky anecdotes suggest he sometimes rehearsed letters aloud to imaginary senators, testing rhetoric and timing, a strange, almost theatrical habit, yet one that honed persuasion. Tensions with local tribes are constant. You trudge with him as he negotiates alliances, arranges hostage exchanges, and occasionally stages acts meant to awe or intimidate. Historians still argue over the morality of some tactics, but the results are clear: compliance, tribute, and a reputation that spreads faster than news could travel. You probably won't survive picturing the delicate balance between fear and respect, the whispering counsels of leaders, and the constant need to predict human behavior. But it's in these moments that Caesar masters both war and diplomacy simultaneously. By the end of the day, you trudge with him back to camp as twilight softens the Gaulish landscape. Soldiers rest, fires flicker, and Caesar's mind, though exhausted, continues to map tomorrow's moves. You probably won't survive the combination of physical rigor, strategic thinking, and psychological acumen without awe. But it's here, amidst mud, march, and musings, that the man who will someday shake the foundations of Rome begins to solidify his indelible mark on history. You trudge with Caesar as the Gallic campaigns reach their peak, rivers swollen from rain, forests dense and treacherous, and distant hills alive with the motion of scouts and enemy watchers. You probably won't survive imagining the constant, unrelenting march of armies, the crunch of boots in mud, and the endless calculations required to maintain supply lines and morale. But this is where his mastery of both human nature and strategy becomes undeniable. You follow him as he confronts the complex web of tribal alliances that seem to shift daily. Each tribe has its customs, leaders, and grudges, and Caesar must navigate them with tact, intimidation, and promise. Historians still argue whether his approach was purely pragmatic or colored by personal ambition. But you can sense the careful calibration of every meeting, every negotiation, and every subtle gesture. Quirky anecdotes suggest he once released a captured wild boar as a symbolic messenger of peace, though historians debate if this actually occurred or was exaggerated for effect. You probably won't survive imagining the mix of absurdity and gravity in such moments without a quiet grin, but they underscore Caesar's inventive psychological approach to leadership. In battle, his attention to detail is relentless. You trudge with him as he examines terrain from hilltops, reviews the alignment of his legions, and adjusts formations in real time. Historians still argue how much luck played a role in certain victories, but the meticulous observation and rapid adaptation are undeniably his own. You notice the sensory elements, the sting of cold rain on armor, the metallic scent of sharpened swords, and the muted murmur of soldiers exchanging glances and orders, all woven together into a living, breathing battlefield. Morale management remains a constant priority. Caesar praises bravery, disciplines fairly, and rewards ingenuity. ensuring that each soldier feels recognized and indispensable. You trudge with him as he listens to grievances and stories alike, understanding that loyalty is as much nurtured by perception as by command. Quirky stories claim he once disguised himself as a common soldier to observe morale firsthand, a move historians still debate, but it illustrates his blend of empathy and cunning. You probably won't survive picturing the sheer psychological load of managing thousands while planning next maneuvers, but it shows the depth of his leadership. Even amid campaigns, political ambition continues to pulse. You trudge with him as he drafts letters to Rome, framing victories in ways that flatter allies and unsettle rivals. Historians still argue whether his writings were largely propaganda or accurate reports, but the intent is clear. Perception is as vital as reality. Quirky habits persist. Reportedly, he sometimes dictated messages while bathing, merging efficiency with eccentricity. You probably won't survive imagining the multitasking, mental strain, and constant performance without admiration. But it's here that Caesar's blend of intellect, charisma, and strategy crystallizes. By nightfall, you trudge with him through the quiet of the camp. Soldiers rest under the stars, fires flicker, and the occasional hoot of an owl punctuates the stillness. Caesar walks silently, surveying positions, noting successes, failures, and opportunities, writing plans for tomorrow. You probably won't survive imagining the relentless vigilance, the simultaneous mental and physical exertion without a sense of awe. But it's in this ceaseless rhythm of observation, adaptation, and strategy that Caesar forges the extraordinary capabilities that will one day allow him to cross rivers, defy the Senate, and reshape Rome itself. You trudge with Caesar as Gaul begins to bend fully under his influence, the landscape marked with fortified camps, supply lines humming like living arteries, and the distant sounds of tribal movements signaling both opportunity and threat. You probably won't survive imagining the constant mental juggling of strategy, diplomacy, and soldierly management without your brain spinning. But this is the crucible where his mastery of power becomes almost instinctual. You follow him as he prepares for the monumental siege of Alesia, the fortress of Vercingetorix. Every decision, from the placement of trenches to the timing of assaults, is calculated. Historians still argue whether the success at Alesia was due more to Caesar's brilliance or Vercingetorix's miscalculations. But you can feel the tension, the meticulous layering of fortifications, the rotation of legions, and the subtle orchestration of psychological pressure. The air is sharp with the smell of wet earth and burning fires, and soldiers move like shadows, following the rhythm of his commands. Quirky elements color even the gravest moments. You trudge with him past stories of using enormous wooden towers as visual deceptions, some with dummy soldiers to create illusions of greater force. Historians still debate the accuracy of these tales, but they underscore his flair for strategy that blends psychology, illusion, and timing. You probably won't survive picturing the ingenuity and audacity without a small smirk, yet it demonstrates how perception can rival brute force in shaping outcomes. The human dimension is equally critical. Caesar attends to the morale of his troops, walking among them, praising valor, calming fears, and occasionally listening to humorous complaints about rations or camp routines. You trudge with him through moments of camaraderie, noticing the delicate balance between authority and empathy. Historians still argue whether loyalty stemmed from admiration, fear, or opportunity, but the legion's steadfastness is unmistakable. Diplomacy and intimidation walk hand in hand. You observe him negotiating with surrendered tribes, accepting hostages, and performing calculated acts of mercy to cement alliances, all while maintaining the aura of unassailable authority. Quirky accounts suggest he once staged a mock execution with actors to instill fear without bloodshed, a tactic historians still debate, but which illustrates his inventive psychology. You probably won't survive imagining the orchestration of such events, yet they reveal the depth of his understanding of human behavior. Even at night, the work continues. You trudge alongside as Caesar writes reports, plans fortifications, and reviews intelligence gathered from scouts and informants. Historians still argue how much of his administrative genius was his alone or owed to capable staff, but you can see the meticulous care with which he integrates information into actionable strategy. You probably won't survive imagining the sheer intellectual stamina required, but this relentless combination of observation, analysis, and decision-making cements his emergence not merely as a general, but as a master of both warfare and perception. By the day's end, you trudge with him through the camp, fires flickering against the walls of hastily constructed trenches, the distant sound of Gallic horns faint but ever present. Caesar's gaze sweeps across the scene, every detail cataloged, every movement noted, and plans formulated for the next day. You probably won't survive picturing the totality of his mental and physical exertion without a sense of awe. But it is in this unrelenting attention to both the world and its people that Caesar prepares to etch his name into history. You trudge with Caesar as the Gallic Wars near their dramatic climax. The once wild forests and rivers now dotted with encampments, observation towers, and the constant hum of organized movement. You probably won't survive imagining the magnitude of coordinating tens of thousands of men, supplies, and intelligence networks across a landscape that seems to resist order. But this is where his genius coalesces into something near mythic. You follow him as he lays siege to Alesia, Vercingetorix's stronghold, the air thick with tension, the clatter of arms, and the smell of damp earth mixed with smoke from countless fires. Historians still argue whether the final victory was the product of unassailable strategy or a fortunate alignment of circumstances. But you can see the meticulous planning, double lines of fortifications, coordinated rotations of legions, and calculated psychological pressure on both the besieged and the relieving Gallic forces. Quirky anecdotes suggest he once instructed soldiers to play eerie war drums at night to unsettle the enemy, a tactic historians debate, but you probably won't survive imagining the effect without a shiver. The human element remains crucial. You trudge with him as he moves among his soldiers, checking morale, resolving disputes, and offering encouragement. Loyalty here is cultivated not only through discipline, but recognition. Every soldier feels seen, every act of bravery noted. Historians still argue whether Caesar's charisma or his strategic brilliance had a greater impact on troop fidelity, but the cohesion of his legions speaks volumes. You probably won't survive picturing the combination of exhaustion and inspiration without a quiet sense of admiration. Negotiations and diplomacy occur alongside combat. You observe him receiving envoys, issuing terms of surrender, and strategically distributing rewards and clemency. Quirky records suggest he sometimes used theatrical demonstrations, such as mock celebratory parades, to impress local tribes, which historians still debate, yet they reflect his understanding of symbolism and perception. You probably won't survive imagining the meticulous orchestration of fear, respect, and spectacle without a slow nod of recognition at his ingenuity. Even amid the intensity, Caesar reflects constantly on lessons learned. You trudge with him through night watches, contemplating failed maneuvers, unexpected alliances, and environmental challenges. Historians still argue how much of his tactical insight derived from instinct versus studied experience. But the record of victories shows an adaptive, deeply analytical mind at work. By the day's end, the camp is quiet yet alive. Fires flicker, sentries murmur, and Caesar moves among sleeping soldiers, noting plans for fortifications, dispatching orders, and contemplating both the immediate battlefield and the distant political horizon of Rome. You probably won't survive imagining the mental and physical endurance required without awe, but it's here in the relentless attention to detail, strategy, and human nature that Caesar solidifies his status as a commander whose influence will echo far beyond Gaul, shaping not only battles, but the very course of history. You trudge with Caesar as the final stages of the Gallic Wars unfold, the horizon lined with both smoke from conquest and the muted hope of submission. You probably won't survive imagining the fatigue that gnaws at even the most disciplined legions, the constant vigilance required, and the pressure of commanding an empire in waiting. But this is the arena where his transformation from brilliant general to a figure of near mythic ambition becomes unmistakable. You follow him as he confronts Vercingetorix in the climactic moments at Alesia. Every maneuver, every order is imbued with precision. Fortifications strengthened, reserves rotated, and psychological pressure exerted not just on the enemy, but to maintain confidence within his ranks. Historians still argue whether Caesar's ultimate success was preordained by his strategy or shaped by luck and circumstance. But the orchestration of events is undeniable. You notice the sensory weight, the damp tang of mud, the groan of wooden fortifications under siege, and the distant roar of warriors, each element feeding into the tension that hangs over the battlefield. Quirky details linger even here. You trudge with him past stories of his use of symbolic gestures, like having his soldiers parade banners in certain patterns to confuse the enemy, or signaling victories with cleverly choreographed trumpet calls. Historians still debate the authenticity of such anecdotes, yet they illustrate his understanding that perception is as potent a weapon as swords or catapults. You probably won't survive picturing these theatrics alongside real-life stakes without a wry smile, but it reveals his combination of strategy, showmanship, and psychological insight. Leadership, as always, remains a mix of discipline and empathy. You trudge alongside as he encourages exhausted soldiers, listens to complaints, and subtly reminds them that survival and glory are intertwined. Historians still argue whether this loyalty stemmed more from fear, admiration, or the tangible rewards of victory, but the unwavering dedication of his legions demonstrates the efficacy of his approach. You also see the diplomatic dimension unfold. Caesar negotiates surrender terms, integrates tribal leaders, and rewards loyalty while demonstrating the consequences of defiance. Quirky records suggest he once staged a mock execution of a symbolic effigy to enforce compliance without actual bloodshed, a tactic historians still debate, but it underscores his inventive approach to power. You probably won't survive imagining the delicate balance of intimidation and diplomacy without recognizing his genius in human management. As night settles, you trudge with him through a quiet camp. Fires flicker against fortified walls, the air cool and heavy with exertion, and Caesar moves among soldiers, writing letters to Rome, planning the next strategic steps, and reflecting on the larger implications of victory. You probably won't survive imagining the constant mental calculation, endurance, and vision without awe. But it is here, in the synthesis of battlefield command, psychological insight, and political foresight, that Caesar truly becomes a figure capable of altering the trajectory of an entire civilization. You trudge with Caesar as the Gallic Wars draw to their final, decisive moments, the landscape scarred with the marks of battle, but also shimmering with the promise of unification under his command. You probably won't survive imagining the sheer exhaustion, the relentless march, the constant calculations, the psychological toll of leading thousands. But this is where his legacy begins to crystallize, where a general becomes an architect of history. You follow him as Vercingetorix finally surrenders, the air thick with tension, the murmurs of weary soldiers, and the weight of expectation pressing down on both victor and vanquished. Historians still argue whether the surrender was inevitable from the start or the result of Caesar's ingenuity, but the scene brims with both drama and careful orchestration. Quirky details survive in the chronicles. Reportedly, Caesar paraded Vercingetorix before his troops in a display meant to impress order and discipline. Yet historians still debate the accuracy of this ceremonial act. You probably won't survive picturing the mix of pride, relief, and exhaustion without feeling a ripple of awe at the human complexity unfolding. Leadership continues to define every moment. You trudge with him through interactions with his legions, offering praise, correcting missteps, and maintaining the delicate balance between fear, loyalty, and admiration. Historians still argue whether it was Caesar's charisma, his meticulous strategy, or a fusion of both that earned such unwavering dedication. But the cohesion of his forces suggests a mastery of both mind and heart. Even amid victory, Caesar's mind reaches toward Rome, plotting not just the next campaign, but the political chessboard awaiting him. You trudge alongside as he pens dispatches, considering which victories to emphasize, which rivalries to exploit, and how perception will shape power. Quirky anecdotes note that he sometimes rehearsed speeches aloud in the middle of the night to imaginary senators, a habit historians still debate, but it reveals the continuous sharpening of his persuasive tools. You probably won't survive imagining the mental load of reconciling battlefield genius with political foresight. Yet it is a testament to his unrelenting discipline and vision. You observe the integration of conquered territories, the negotiation of loyalty, and the careful structuring of new political relationships. Every act, whether granting clemency, imposing tribute, or demonstrating mercy, is calculated, blending strategy, diplomacy, and psychology. Historians still debate the morality versus pragmatism of some of his methods, but the result is clear. Gaul is no longer a patchwork of rebellious tribes, but a domain unified, at least temporarily, under his authority. By nightfall, you trudge with him through the camp, fires glowing faintly, stars stretching across the Gaulish sky. Caesar moves silently, cataloging the day, planning the next, reflecting on the long road from his youth to this pinnacle of power. You probably won't survive imagining the totality of his physical and mental exertion without awe, but it is here in the fusion of courage, intellect, vision, and relentless perseverance that the man who will cross the Rubicon and redefine Rome is fully realized. Every victory, misstep, quirk, and calculation has prepared him for the destiny that awaits. You trudge alongside, witnessing not just history, but the shaping of legend. The camp quiets around you, and you trudge slowly through the soft flicker of embers, feeling the chill of the night air settle against your skin. The legions are asleep, their breathing a steady rhythm beneath the canvas of stars stretching endlessly overhead. You probably won't survive imagining the stillness after such relentless movement without feeling the weight of exhaustion yourself. But the quiet allows the mind to wander gently, tracing the long, winding path that brought Caesar from boyhood to commander, from ambition to legend. You notice the subtle details, the rustle of leaves in a gentle breeze, the distant call of a night bird, the faint metallic scent of abandoned armor cooling on the ground. Historians still argue about the significance of minor events along the Gallic campaigns. Yet here, stripped of the clamor of battle, the cumulative effect of decisions, foresight, and tireless observation becomes clear. You feel the pulse of history beneath your feet, a reminder that even the smallest choice can ripple across time, shaping lives, nations, and legacies. Quirky anecdotes linger in your mind, flaming pigs, phantom legions, mock parades, and late-night dictations, but they no longer amuse. They resonate as testament to human ingenuity and the playful, unpredictable threads that weave through even the gravest of endeavors. You probably won't survive picturing the combination of genius and eccentricity without a quiet smile. Yet these small flourishes are part of the tapestry that makes Caesar, Caesar. As you drift further along the camp, the boundaries between past and present soften. The forests, rivers, and encampments feel both distant and immediate, and you sense the weight of endurance, leadership, and vision that guided every step of his journey. Historians still debate the man versus the myth, but for tonight, you simply walk beside him, feeling the quiet intensity of a mind that never rested, a spirit that never wavered. The air grows cooler, the fires burn lower, and you allow yourself to exhale, letting the tension of battles and strategies dissolve into the soft hum of the night. You probably won't survive imagining the scope of his ambition without awe, but you can carry a fragment of it with you, a quiet inspiration that whispers through the stillness. Now the world softens, shadows lengthen, and you, like the legions, can finally rest beside the enduring echo of one of history's most relentless minds.